Chapter 7, Spenser and his time. Looking back on the poetry of the 16th century with the historian's perspective, we can see clearly enough that the endeavor to establish English as a poetic language, at least the equal of Italian and French, prompted much of the experimentation and exercising that went on in Tudor verse. It is true that among the production of poets between Wyatt and Spenser we do find some accomplished lyrics and an occasional success in longer and graver kinds of verse. But an air of uncertainty still hung over everything, and the poet who could turn out a deft song at one moment might very well fall, on another occasion, into the crudest jog-trot or the most wooden kind of labored regularity. England awaited the poet who could pull together the diverse elements that had been operating in Tudor verse, who could profit by Renaissance Latinists, by Italian and French developments in the vernacular, by new ideas about the function and prestige of the poet, by classical example, by new currents in religious and philosophical thought, as well as by the exercising of the English language that had been going on, who could at the same time look back to Chaucer and, while absorbing and benefiting from all the new currents, re-establish contact with the great medieval master of English verse, and who would be simultaneously Elizabethan and European, drawing inspiration both from the national excitement of his own time and country and from the larger movements of the mind and the imagination which were agitating the whole of Western civilization. Classical, medieval, and humanist, inspired equally by the new Puritan idealism and by the reawakened interest in Platonic thought, moved both by the new Protestant gravity and by the Catholic sense of the unity of Western culture. Supreme craftsman with a great synthesizing imagination, such was the poet the times now required if the full riches of Elizabethan England were to find adequate expression in poetry. The greatest genius that England produced at this and at any time did not turn directly to this synthesizing task but used all this material with careless brilliance in the dramatic exploration of the relation between the moral and emotional aspects of man. Shakespeare was not the new poet the Elizabethans were looking for. His genius was too large and too self-conscious for him to see himself as contributing to any specific historical end. It was Edmund Spenser, 1552–99, who saw himself, as he was seen by his contemporaries, in the role of the new poet who was to draw the threads together and mark both a culmination and a new beginning in English poetry. Spenser was the great synthesizer for whom English non-dramatic poetry was waiting. The publication of the Shepherd's Calendar in 1579 marked Spenser's formal entry as the new poet. An unpretentious and uneven work to modern eyes, not much read today except by specialists and students. The Shepherd's Calendar is the perfect example of a work of greater historical importance than of permanent and intrinsic poetic interest. The title, in Spenser's or his printer's spelling, is worth recording. The Shepherd's Calendar, containing 12 eglogs proportionable to the 12 months. Entitled to the noble and virtuous gentleman most worthy of all titles both of learning and chivalry, M. Philip Sidney. The Eclogue, or pastoral dialogue, spelled eglogue, by Spenser and many of his contemporaries because of a false derivation from the Greek word for goatherd, has its origin in Sicilian folk song and comes first into literature in the work of Theocritus, Bion, and Moschus, Greek Sicilian poets of the 3rd century BC. It was a form widely used in the Renaissance, deriving more often from the eclogues of Virgil than directly from the Greek pastoralists. By the time Spenser was writing, there were eclogues in Italian and French as well as in Renaissance Latin. And pastoral poetry, i.e., poetry dealing with shepherds, or ideal shepherds, was established as an accepted poetic form, ranking below epic or heroic poetry, which was at the top of the poetic ladder in Renaissance criticism, and below tragedy, but laudable nevertheless and especially appropriate for a poet beginning his poetic career. Virgil had started with eclogues and moved on at last to his great epic. The proper course for an ambitious new poet was clear. Not only was the pastoral well established in Renaissance poetry by Spenser's time, it had also been frequently used in an allegorical manner for moral and satirical purposes. Pastoral allegory was thus an established note. Almost any aspect of human life could be presented through the elemental activities of shepherds. Rural work has always been an obvious prototype of all human endeavor, being, as it were, the primal human activity. And the work of the shepherd is not only an obvious example of rustic labor, it also includes the element of guardianship, which makes it easy to discuss either political rulers or spiritual leaders in pastoral terms. The elemental background of pastoral activity also makes pastoral poetry an appropriate vehicle for the presentation of the more elemental human emotions, such as love or grief. The Renaissance poets, excited at the potentialities of the literary use of the pastoral, exploited it to the point of exhaustion, with the result that it is now regarded as one of the most faded of literary forms. But for Spenser it was a richly promising medium, and an obvious one for a manifesto of the new poetry. Linking his eclogues together in a calendar, Spenser found a happy way of combining unity with diversity, as well as of combining the simple and rustic with the elaborate and sophisticated. By varying the degree to which his shepherds were allegorical, he could vary the tone from the naively pastoral to the elaborately formal. And by making his shepherds compete in singing matches, in a formula that goes back to the Greek pastoralists, he was enabled to introduce into his pastoral framework a diversity of lyrical poems in different styles. The poet who influenced him most in his allegorical use of the pastoral was the 15th century Italian, Battista Spanulli, known in literature as Mantuanus or Mantung, whose 10 Latin eclogues on moral and religious themes were used as a schoolbook throughout Europe. But Spenser also knew Theocritus and Bion, and there were Latin and French versions. If he needed help with the original, the Latin eclogues of Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Jacopo Sannazaro, and the 2 French eclogues of Clement Marot, which he imitated in his November and December poems. In short, Spenser was working confidently in a European tradition, both classical and humanist. Spenser sent the Shepherd's Calendar into the world with an introduction and commentary by E.K., who was probably Edward Kirk, who had been a fellow student of Spenser's at Cambridge, and who certainly had been briefed carefully by Spenser about his intentions in producing the poem. One is reminded of Stuart Gilbert's commentary on James Joyce's Ulysses, which was also an explanation of a new kind of work by someone who had had the benefit of talks with the author about its meaning and purpose. E.K. could make claims for Spenser that the poet was too modest to make himself, but which nevertheless must have fairly represented Spenser's own view of his function and ambitions. A.K.'s introduction, addressed to Spenser's friend, the scholar and man of letters Gabriel Harvey, makes all the points necessary to emphasize the importance of the work. He begins with a quotation, or rather, misquotation, from Chaucer, and links Spenser both with Chaucer and with Virgil. He goes on to refer to Spenser's wittiness in devising, his pithiness in uttering, his complaints of love so lovely, his discourses of pleasure so pleasantly, his pastoral rudeness, his moral wiseness, his due observing of decorum everywhere, in personages, in seasons, in matter, in speech, and generally in all seemly simplicity of handling his matter and framing his words, the which of many things which in him be strange, I know will seem the strangest, the words themselves being so ancient, the knitting of them so short and intricate, and the whole period and compass of speech so delightsome for the roundness and so grave for the strangeness. The emphasis on decorum is significant. Decorum meant propriety and fitness of tone and diction and verse form, the suiting of the style to the matter, the deliberate avoidance of anything disproportionate or incongruous. It was an important Renaissance aesthetic ideal, and in showing himself concerned with it, Spenser is not only exhibiting a debt to the critical thought of his age but also showing his awareness of a prime need of English poetry at this time. Decorum was conspicuously lacking in the majority of the earlier Tudor poets. Biblical paraphrase in Poulter's Measure, for example, such as we find more than once in Tottel's Miscellany, is a clear violation of decorum. Knock and it shall be heard, but ask and given it is, and all that like to keep this course of mercy shall not miss. For when I call to mind how the one wandering sheep did bring more joy with his return than all the flock did keep, it yields full hope and trust my strayed and wandering ghost shall be received and held more dear than those were never lost. Spenser put an end to this sort of thing. E.K. refers with contempt to the Tudor versifiers as the rakehelly rout of our ragged rhymers, for so themselves used to hunt the letter, i.e., practice alliteration, which without learning boast, without judgment jangle, without reason, rage and foam, as if some instinct of poetical spirit had newly ravished them above the meanness of common cap tilde city. That is poetry without decorum, which Milton was later to call the chief masterpiece to be observed. E.K. praises Spenser for preserving the continuity of English poetry by using a certain number of older words, and using them appropriately. Spenser, he says, hath laboured to restore, as to their rightful heritage, such good and natural English words as have been long time out of use and almost clean disherited. Pride in the vernacular comes out strongly in E.K.'s remarks on the English language and its potentialities. He praises Spenser both for his choice of words and for his knitting of sentences. And for all the compass of the speech, which he calls round without roughness and learned without hardness. He classes him with the great classical and Renaissance poets, suggesting that the Shepherd's Calendar is the pioneer work of a new English poet worthy to be ranked with them. So, i.e., in Eclogue's flew Theocritus. As you may perceive, he was already full-fledged. So flew Virgil, as not yet well feeling his wings. So flew Mantung, as being not full SOMD. So Petrarch, so Boccaccio, so Marot, Sanazaris, and also divers other excellent both Italian and French poets, whose footing this author everywhere followeth, yet so is few, but they be well centered, can trace him out. So finally flieth this our new poet, as a bird, whose principles be scarce grown out, but yet is that, in time shall be able to keep wing with the best. Though the modern reader may feel a certain anticlimax in coming from this enthusiastic preface to the poems themselves, he cannot fail, if he comes to the Shepherd's Calendar from earlier Tudor poetry, to be struck by the control and the assurance of Spenser's verse. In the January Eclogue, the shepherd Colin Clout, who is Spenser himself, the name comes from an anti-clerical satire of Skelton's, is complaining of his unrequited love for Rosalind. Spenser thus adapts a Petrarchan mood to a pastoral setting. The stanza has 6 lines, rhymed ABABCC. A shepherd's boy, no better do him call, when winter's wasteful spite was almost spent all in a sunshine day, as did befall, led forth his hawk, that had hing long ypent. So faint they walks, and feeble in the fold, that now and neds their feet could them uphold. All as the sheep, such was T.B.E. Shepherd's look. For pale and wan he was, alas the while, may seem he loved, or else some care he took. Well could he tune his pipe and frame his style. Then to a hill his fainting hawk he led, and thus him plained, the while his sheep there fed. Ye gods of love, that pity lovers' pain, if any gods the pain of lovers pity. Look from above, where you in joys remain, and bow your ears unto my doleful ditty. And Pan, thou shepherd's god, that once didst love, pity the pains that thou thyself didst prove. Quote. We see here the deliberate archaisms that Spenser was to experiment with much more before he settled on the diction for the Fairy Queen. Spenser is trying to combine rusticity with formality. The February Eclogue, which tells the story of the oak and the briar, is written in a rougher accentual measure, which Spenser seems to have considered a genuine English verse form and one suitable for the handling of more deliberately rustic themes. Whether this looser meter represents how Spenser and his contemporaries read Chaucer, not understanding the pronunciation of the final A, or whether Spenser was trying to do something resembling what Coleridge did in Christabel, is not clear. But it is clear that Spenser used this accentual verse deliberately as a style appropriate to the subject of this eclogue. He used it again in the May and September eclogues. The March eclogue gives the dialogue of two shepherds in the old romance stanza that Chaucer had used so mockingly in Sir Thopas. Tomalin tells Willie how he saw Cupid in a bush, and they exchanged shots, but the naturalistic pastoral setting makes the incident sound rather incongruous. We expect a grouse or a partridge rather than the little god. The April eclogue, after an introductory dialogue between the knot and Hobbinol in flexible decasyllabic quatrains, introduces a formal song in praise of Elizabeth. The verse form, though perhaps suggested by Ronsard and his group, Le Piedi, is an interesting original experiment. Ye dainty nymphs, that in this blessed brook do bathe your breast, forsake your watery bowers and hither look, at my request, and eke you virgins that on Parnass dwell, whence howeth Helicon, the learned well. Help me to blaze her worthy praise which in her sex doth all excel. There is a careful chiming of vowels through the song, which has 13 stanzas, and cunning variations of tempo, foreshadowing Spenser's later achievements in sound and movement. The May eclogue is a dialogue between two shepherds in which, through the obvious pastoral disguise, Spenser attacks idle, deceitful, and worldly high church clergy, whose fondness for elaborate ritual offended Spenser's Protestant idealism. June brings another complaint, in an 8-line stanza rhyming Abababa. Colin complains not only of his lack of success in love, but of his lack of success in his poetry and his generally unsettled condition. The slow-moving verse rises and falls in a fine plangent cadence. The July eclogue is another Protestant satire, made, as E.K.'s argument tells us, in the honor and commendation of good shepherds, and to the shame and dispraise of proud and ambitious pastors. The proud shepherd, Morel, probably denoting John Elmer, the High Church Bishop of London, argues with the humble and conscientious Tomalin, who concludes by praising Algren, i.e., Edmund Grindal, Archbishop of Canterbury and Puritan sympathizer, as the type of the Good Shepherd. The verse form is alternately rhyming 8-syllabled and 6-syllabled lines, handled with ease and assurance. August gives a singing match, with a charming roundelay by Perrault and Willie followed by a much more formal sestina by Cuddy. The roundelay is fresh and artfully artless, Perrault. It fell upon a holy eve, Willie, hey ho holiday, per. When holy fathers wont to shrieve, Will. Now ginneth this roundelay, per. Sitting upon a hill so high, Will. Hey ho the high hill, per. The while my hawk did feed thereby, Will. The while the shepherd self did spill, per. I saw the bouncing bellabone, Will. Hey ho bony bull, per. Tripping over the dale alone, Will. She can trip it very well. This draws on the popular tradition, but embodies more skill than may be at first apparent. The chiming repetitions and modifications of Willy's lines are handled with effective variety. The Sestina, an elaborate verse form from Petlatch, is a slow-moving 6-line stanza, with each stanza using the same words to end the lines, but in a different order. It opens, "Ye wasteful woods, bear witness of my woe wherein my plaints did oftentimes resound. Ye careless birds are privy to my cries, which in your songs were wont to make a part. Thou pleasant spring hast lulled me oft asleep, whose streams my trickling tears did oft augment." The lines of the second stanza end, respectively, with augment, woes, resound, cries, part, sleep. Those of the third stanza end, sleep, augment, woe, resound, cries, part. Those of the fourth, with a part, sleep, augment, woe, you sound, cries, and so on. Elaborate though this is, it is less elaborate than the Petrarchan Sestina. Spenser is here performing a deliberate tour de force. It is Collins, i.e., Spenser's poem that Cuddy recites, and Perigot provides the applause afterward. "O Colin, Colin, the shepherd's joy, how I admire each turning of thy verse." The September Eclogue is a dialogue between Hobbinall and Digon Davie. The latter is a shepherd that in hope of more gain drove his sheep into a far country, the abuses whereof, and loose living of popish prelates, by occasion of Hobbinall's demand, he discourseth at large. Spenser takes many suggestions here from Manton, but the Protestant content is his own. The October Eclogue is in many ways the most important of all, for it voices, for the first time in English, the high Renaissance ideal of poetry. In Cuddy is set out the perfect pattern of a poet, runs the argument, and though the presentation of this perfect pattern is accompanied by Cuddy's complaints that the age of great poetry is dead, the exhortations of his friend Piers sound the louder note. The argument reads like a summary of Sidney's defense of poetry. Cuddy complaineth of the contempt of poetry, arid the causes thereof, specially having been in all ages, and even amongst the most barbarous, always of singular account and honor, and being indeed so worthy and commendable an art. Or rather no art, but a divine gift and heavenly instinct not to be gotten by labor and learning, but adorned with both, and poured into the wit by a certain evuovuacus in celestial inspiration. As the author here or elsewhere at large discourseth, the verse has a gravity suited to the subject. Abandon then the base and vile clown, lift up thyself out of the lowly dust, and sing of bloody mass, of wars, of jousts. Turn thee to those that wield the awful crown, to doubted knights whose woundless armor rusts, and helms unbruised waxen daily brown. There may thy muse display her fluttering wing, and stretch herself at large from east to west. And again, Piers breaks out on hearing Cuddy lament the present decline of poetry. "O peerless poesy, where is then thy place? If nor in prince's palace thou do sit, and yet is prince's palace the most fit, nay breast of baser birth doth thee embrace. Then make thee wings of thine aspiring wit, and, whence thou canst, fly back to heaven apace." The strain of lament here is conventional. The note of faith in poetry's high destiny rings out clearly above it. The November Eclogue is a lament for the death of some maiden of great blood, whom he calleth Dido. It is based on a similar poem by Marot. The lament is introduced as a song sung for pleasure rather than an expression of personal grief. The Eclogue opens with Leonore asking Colin, "Colin my dear, when shall it please thee sing, as thou were wont, songs of some jovisance?" And Colin replies that a joyful song is not seasonable in sad winter, when the mournful muse is more appropriate. Like the poem in praise of Elizabeth in the April Eclogue. The lament which Colin proceeds to sing is an exercise in the handling of vowel music and variations in tempo. Why do we longer live? Ah! Why live we so long? Whose better days death hath shut up in woe? The fairest hour our joined all among is faded quite and into dust YGOE. Sing now, ye shepherds' daughters. Sing no more the songs that Colin made you in her praise. But into weeping turn your wanton lays, O heavy hearse. Now is time to die. Nay, time was long YGOE, O careful verse. Careful, sorrowful, the short lines, O heavy hearse, and O careful verse, are repeated as a refrain at the end of each stanza. The December Eclogue is an imitation of Marot's Eclogue au Roi, in which the poet looks back over his poetic career. It is suited to the time of the year, the poet reviewing the change from the springtime of his days to the present time. So now my year draws to his latter term, my spring is spent. My summer burnt up quite. My harvest hastes to stir up winter's stem, and bids him claim with rigorous rage his right. So now he storms with many a sturdy stour. So now his blustering blast each coast doth scour. So ends this varied collection of eclogues in which Spenser tried out his genius and presented himself to the public as England's new poet. Technically, they are of the very greatest interest. The 13 different verse forms which Spenser includes in the 12 eclogues, 2 of them new to English verse and 5 Spenser's own invention, show what English verse craftsmanship was capable of in 1579. And they also point forward to later developments. But besides their importance for the craft of English verse, they are important for drawing together traditions from the golden age of medieval English poetry, from the Latin and Greek classics, and from the Renaissance literature of Italy and France, and domiciling them happily in English poetry, where they were to remain for 3 centuries. We see here, too, Spenser's Protestant idealism, something of his Neoplatonic philosophy, and his high claims for poetry. All of these elements were to combine later more richly and subtly in the Faerie Queene. It is appropriate, and not merely a matter of historica convenience, to see all Spenser's earlier work in the perspective provided by the Faerie Queene, which is the culmination toward which Spenser was always moving and the great synthesis of themes and influences which the Elizabethan age had been awaiting. Spenser was well LLTTED, both by temperament and education, to absorb and to handle creatively the moral and intellectual currents of his time. At the Merchant Taylors' School, then presided over by Richard Mulcaster, a scholar with all the Renaissance enthusiasm for education and for the new ideal of the perfect gentleman, and at Cambridge, where he formed a lasting friendship with the scholar and critic Gabriel Harvey, who was both Puritan and humanist. He came into contact with the kind of scholarship and enthusiasms to which his own high idealism responded immediately. Spenser's combination of Italian Neoplatonism with English Protestantism, his imaginative handling of his own very considerable scholarship, his responsiveness to the challenge and excitement of his age, reflect the interaction of his education and environment with his temperament. He was never the complete courtier, for place-seeking at Elizabeth's court was hardly in accordance with his own concept of the perfect Christian gentleman, and besides, his Puritanism led him to oppose aspects of Elizabeth's compromise between the extremes of Protestantism and Catholicism. His failure to secure a higher government position than that of a civil servant in Ireland, where he spent most of his life from 1580 until his death in 1599, or a more substantial governmental recognition of his claims than a pension of £50 a year, is not surprising. But he became a friend and admirer of Sir Philip Sidney, whom Together with so many of his contemporaries, he regarded as the beau ideal of knighthood and courtesy, and was an active participant in the most significant literary discussions of his time. And much of his occasional writing deals, either directly or indirectly, with the contemporary scene. Indeed, he never withdrew from contemporary religious and political controversies into an unreal world of the imagination. He was always concerned with the problems of his day, as well as with broader issues. And the Faerie Queene itself is an allegorical commentary on the religious, political, and social scene, as well as a more general poetic exploration of the nature of virtue. Spenser's confident entry as the new poet with the Shepherd's Calendar was not immediately followed up by anything spectacular. The first 3 books of the Faerie Queene were not published until 1590, and books 4 to 6 appeared in 1596. But in the interval he had written a variety of other verse of varying degrees of high seriousness. A volume of minor poems appeared in 1591, entitled Complaints, containing sundry small poems of the world's vanity. This contains The Ruins of Time, an elegiac poem written in slow-moving rhyme royal. Its structure is borrowed from Du Bellai's Antiquités de Rome, and its theme combines the general medieval oubisant motif with reflections on the deaths of the Earl of Leicester, Sir Philip Sidney, and Sir Francis Walsingham. There is also the notion that poetry can confer immortality. The Ruins of Time is an uneven poem, which shows signs of having been put together in haste. But the verse is never out of control, and there are passages of richly musical elegy. The Tears of the Muses is the second of the complaints, written in a stanza rhyming ABABCC. It is more satirical than elegiac in tone and laments the decay of the arts and other abuses of the time in a rather mechanical manner. Each of the 9 muses speaks her complaint, and the whole apparatus is somewhat old-fashioned for a new poet. It probably represents fairly early work. More interesting is the third poem in the collection, Virgil's Gnat, a lively rendering in Ottawa Reamer of the Latin, Callax, an Epyllion or little epic attributed to Virgil. But by far the most interesting poem in the book is Mother Hubbard's Tale, a skillful and spirited satire on contemporary affairs in the form of a beast fable, Chaucerian in tone, with the rhymed couplets moving in a deliberately conversational cadence. This vigorous attack on abuses in economic, ecclesiastical, court, and government affairs shows what Spenser could do when he kept his eye sharply on the contemporary English scene. Here is a very different poet from the author of the Faerie Queene. But if thee list unto the court to throng, and there to hunt after the hoped prey, then must thou thee dispose another way, for there thou needs must learn to laugh, to lie, to face, to forge, to scoff, to company, to crouch, to please, to be a beetle stalk of thy great master's will, to scorn or mock, so meet thou chance mock out a benefice. Unless thou canst one conjure by device, or cast a figure for a bishopric, and if one could, it were but a school trick. This links the accents of Chaucer with those found in the satires of Dryden and Pope. The Complaints volume also contains some translations from Marot and Du Bellay of no great interest in themselves, and the charming and sprightly Muiopotomos, or The Fate of the Butterfly, a mock heroic account in Ottawa Reamer of the capture and destruction of a beautiful butterfly by a baleful spider. It may not have an allegorical meaning. The same year, Spenser published Daphnida, an elegy upon the death of the noble and virtuous Douglas Howard, daughter and heir of Henry Lord Howard, Viscount Bunden, and wife of Arthur Gorges, a squire, a formal piece in a stanza which chimes interestingly in a rhyme scheme ABABCBC. The model appears to have been Chaucer's Book of the Duchess. But Spenser's style is more rhetorical and his verse more highly wrought. Colin Cloud's Come Home Again, published in 1595, is one of the freshest, most personal, and most attractive of Spenser's occasional poems. It tells, through a simple and easily penetrated pastoral allegory, of Sir Walter Ralegha's visit to Spenser in Ireland. D. Spenser's subsequent visit to London with Raleigh. There he was graciously received by Queen Elizabeth, but realized that court life was not for him, and he retired to Ireland. The poem has decasyllabic quatrains with alternating rhymes. Occasionally the rhymes are repeated or otherwise linked in successive quatrains, with a highly musical effect. The ease and how of the style, the combination of the autobiographical and the formal, the wholly successful mixture of the pastoral with the courtly, the rustic with the artificial, constitute one of Spenser's happiest attempts at synthesis. The premature death of Sir Philip Sidney at the Battle of Zutphen in 1586 called forth the usual spate of elegies, and Spenser's contribution was a pastoral elegy entitled Astrophale, an uninspired performance in stanzas rhyming ababcc, modelled on Byron's lament for Adonis. That the death of so cherished a friend should have inspired such a highly conventional piece of work is an interesting commentary on the place of convention in Elizabethan art. While the fact that the poem is dedicated to Sidney's widow while referring in some detail to Sidney's love for Stella, traditionally identified with Penelope Devereux, Lady Rich, who did not return Sidney's love, poses a problem in the relation between art and life that the modern mind finds hard to solve. The problem reminds us of how purely formal the notion as well as the handling of courtly love could be in Elizabethan times, and presumably earlier, and warns us against interpreting Spenser's allegorizing habit too naively. A more interesting example of Spenser's handling of a convention of his time is provided by his Amoretti, love sonnets in the Petrarchan mode so dear to the Elizabethans. To what extent these sonnets celebrate his love for Elizabeth Boyle, his marriage to whom he celebrated in his Epithalamion, is an unprofitable question. They tell the story of the poet's wooing of a mistress who at first rebuffed him, then relented and returned his love, and finally, as a result of some unhappy incident, turned against him again. If the Epithalamion represents the true end of this story, then we must suppose that the lady changed her mind yet again, and permanently this time. But again we must remember the place of the sonnet sequence in Elizabethan poetry and the place of convention Elizabethan art. Spenser's sonnets may well have been a graceful Petrarchan exercise with a constantly shifting relationship to his personal experience. Just as in the Fairy Queen the allegory keeps shifting in perspective, as it were, at one point logically worked out in every detail and in another yielding to the psychological realism of the characters who are given emotions and actions beyond their allegorical role. So in other phases of his work Spenser was in the habit of varying the relation of his art to his life. A sonnet sequence was a Eftiarmal Hantal, ng of language which tested the skill and craftsmanship of the poet, and it was to be appreciated for the poetic life kindled within it, not for its autobiographical revelations. Sincerity in art does not mean autobiographical accuracy, but a full and subtle exploitation of the artist's medium so that the poem creates as it moves its own world of experience. That world, of course, does have reference to and does illuminate the real world of human experience, but not necessarily through a direct projection of the poet's autobiography. We should bear these obvious points in mind when we read the Elizabethan sonnet sequences, whether Spenser's, Sidney's, Daniel's, Drayton's, or Shakespeare's. The 89 sonnets that make up the Amoretti move with a limpid how and show a remarkably consistent level of craftsmanship. Though they never rise to some overwhelming moment like Drayton's famous "Since There's No Help," come let us kiss and part, Sydney's Leave Me. Zero love which reacheth but to dust, or some of Shakespeare's. There are, naturally, many echoes of Petrarch, and some of Tasso, Ronsard, Despotes, and others. The usual, though not invariable, rhyme scheme as ABABBCBCCDCD, with the first 12 lines deftly linked by rhyme and movement and separated from the final couplet. The best known of the sonnets of the Amoretti is a fair sample of the controlled how Spenser achieves in these poems. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. Vain man, said she, that dost in vain essay a mortal thing so to immortalize. For J myself shall K to this decay, and eke my name be wiped out likewise. Not so, quoth I, let baser things devise to die in dust, but you shall llve by fame. My verse your virtues rare as for all eternize. And in the heavens write your glorious name. Where, when as death shall all the world subdue, O tilde love shall live, and later life renew. The Epithalamion is an altogether more remarkable piece of work, and one of Spenser's highest achievements. This celebration of his own wedding, which took place in Ireland, probably in 1594, roused all Spenser's genius for enriching and transfiguring bare fact by poetic imagination and by the appropriate use of imagery and of rhythms. Convention and personal feeling here find their perfect meeting. And it is testimony to the way in which the whole tradition of European poetry had become part of Spenser's very personality that he should exploit that tradition most fully, most happily, and most originally when he came to express one of the supreme moments of his own life. The elaborate verse paragraph derives from the Italian canzone, but the handling of the melody, the use of the refrain, the adaptation of a lyrical poem to a narrative structure, the blending of descriptive details with the celebratory mood, the mingling of elements from Catullus, from Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls, from Irish setting, English folklore, and from classical tradition, shows original poetic genius in control of its richly diversified materials to a degree that English poetry had not yet seen. The architectonic quality both of the individual stanza and of the poem as a whole is remarkable. And the chiming refrain subtly varied yet sufficiently the same to bind the poem together with its incantatory repetition is something to marvel at. Here is the new poetry reaching to heights of complex lyrical expression that were not before possible in English. The narrative basis is simple. Why the story of the wedding day? First the poet's announcement of his subject, then an account of the preparatium for the wedding and the bidding of the guests, then a summons to the nymphs of the local woods, streams, and mountains to bring garlands for the bride and sing her praise, then dawn and the awakening of the bride. With the bride's appearance the verse takes on a new richness and a new excitement. Her progress is described in language that echoes the Psalms. Lo, where she comes along with portly pace, like fiend from her chamber of the east, arising forth to run her mighty race. Clad all in white, that seems a virgin best. So well it her beseems that ye would ween some angel she had been. Her long loose yellow locks like golden wire, sprinkled with pearl, and pearling flowers atween, do like a golden mantle her attire, and, being crowned with a garland green, seem like some maiden queen. Her modest eyes, abashed to behold so many gazers as on her do stare, upon the lowly ground affixed are, nay dare lift up her countenance too bold, but blush to hear her praises sung so loud, so far from being proud. Nathless do ye still loud her praises sing, that all the woods may answer and your echo ring. The bride's beauty, both physical and spiritual, is now praised, and by this time the wedding procession has reached the church, and the bride enters to the sound of the organ. Open the temple gates unto my love, open them wide that she may enter in. There follow the ceremony, the homecoming, the poet longing for the end of day. When will this long weary day have end, and lend me leave to come unto my love? How slowly do the hours their numbers spend, how slowly does sad time his feathers move. Haste thee, zero fairest planet, to thy home, within the western foam. The bride's attendants are dismissed, Night descends, and the poet invokes peace and blessing on his bride. The moon rises and looks in at the window, and she too is invoked to bless the marriage. Juno and Genius are asked to grant the blessing of fruitfulness, and the poem ends on a note of calm yet eloquent benediction, with a 7-line coda in which the poet commends his song to his love. This is poetic celebration carried as far as it can go. It is Spenser at the very height of its genius. Only quotation of the whole poem could demonstrate to those who are not familiar with it its extraordinary artistry, for each part gains immensely by contributing to the total movement. Not quite so rich, but equally brilliant in imagery and movement, is the Prothalamion, a wedding poem written for the double wedding of Lady Elizabeth and Lady Catherine Somerset, daughters of the Earl of Worcester, to Henry Guilford and William Petre in 1596. Here again we have the massive and musical stanza with its concluding refrain, "Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song." The adroitly varied line lengths, the movement from a hushed picture of early morning by the Thames to the ceremonious entry of the two swans who symbolize the two bridegrooms. The Prothalamion is more deliberately stylized than the Epithalamion. It has a tapestry quality, an almost heraldic tone, yet the personal note is effectively blended with this, and the poet himself as the vividly presented observer of the ceremonious scene. The benediction pronounced on the swans by one of the nymphs has a grave stateliness unsurpassed in English poetry. Ye gentle birds, the world's fair ornament, and heaven's glory, whom this happy hour doth lead unto your lover's blissful bower. Joy may you have and gentle heart's content of your love's couplement. And let fair Venus, that is queen of love, with her heart-quelling sun upon you smile. W.T. Howe's smile, they say, hath virtue to remove all love's dislike, and friendship's faulty guile forever to assail. Let endless peace your steadfast hearts accord, and blessed plenty wait upon your board, and let your bed with pleasures chaste abound, that fruitful issue may to you afford, which may your foes confound, and make your joys redound, upon your bridal day, which is not long. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song.